They're there to communicate with the spirits of dead Nephilim, dead Rephaim, who are buried beneath the tombs, not in the tombs, beneath the tombs. The giants were buried beneath the tombs so that the galleries were built on top and the young people could go in and incubate with the spirit of the giant. These things were potentially factories for demon possession. You go into the tomb, you get possessed by a spirit of a Nephilim, the spirit of a dead giant, which are the possessing spirits according to the scriptures, and you come out demonized. This is Timothy Alberino, and you are watching End Times Productions.
What did he just say?
Did he just say what I think he said?
It's a factory for
demon possession, I think.
This mummy is one of the Nephilim, the fallen ones.
So let's consider the fact that the Catholic Church, that the Church of Rome, has commandeered the most sacred sites all around the Western world. All of the most important ancient temples and sacred sites. This was a process that was practiced by the Church of Rome called synchronization. And synchronization, basically, what synchronization meant was if you and I are conquistadors, and with the conquistadors came the priests, and the conquistadors were loyal to either the King of Spain or the King of Portugal, but also to the Pope of Rome. So they had this dual loyalty to their king and country, but also to the Holy See and to the pontiff, to the Pope. And so wherever they went, they were conquering for the king and in the name of God for the Catholic Church, for the Church of Rome, in the name of the Pope. So part of this process was to identify the most important temples and palaces of the cultures in Central and South America, and in fact all over the world, wherever the Church of Rome was dominant, and to, in some cases, demolish those temples and rebuild on top of them, and in almost every case rebuild a church or cathedral or a convent, or to simply repurpose the temple and modify it, such as is the case in Cusco with Santo Domingo. Santo Domingo, they didn't completely demolish the Coricancha because you still have the ruins of the Coricancha on the premises today. They demolished part of it and they erected the cathedral and convent of Santo Domingo. So this is synchronization. The reason why they do this, it's a show of force. It's like planting your flag on the most important sacred sites of your enemy, but then also it's a way of amalgamating the old religious practices, the old cult practices of the native people into the new established religion that is being established by the conquerors, and that being Catholicism. So where once the natives used to come to this site to worship their various gods, now they come to the site to take Mass, to take communion and become subjugated to the Church of Rome. That's synchronization. And some of the practices of the various religions of these native people, such as the Inca in Peru, such as the Aztec in Central America, were incorporated into Catholicism, into that particular brand of Catholicism. For example, Catholicism in Central and South America has its own brand in comparison to Europe. There's some differences. There are some traditions that you'll find in Central and South America, Catholic traditions, which are distinct from those in Europe, because they're amalgamations of some of the old religious practices of the natives. And this is called synchronization. And synchronization is very useful if you want to quickly convert the native populace to Catholicism. You use the practice of synchronization. You occupy their holy sites. You build your temples on their holy sites, and you synchronize the religion of the Church of Rome, which is Roman Christianity, with the religions of the native populace. Of course, the population is forcibly converted and ultimately has to submit to the catechism of the church, but with some leeway so that they could continue to incorporate some of their traditional practices. So as a result of synchronization, there's many places around the world where you once had pagan temples. Today you have Catholic cathedrals, Catholic churches, Catholic convents, and so forth. Well, what that translates to is a wealth of knowledge and treasure that has been accrued over the centuries by the Catholic Church. Not just treasure, but knowledge. So many of the artifacts that were in the temples fell into the hands of the Roman Catholic Church and probably made their way, if they were important enough, would have made their way to Rome and ended up in the vaults beneath the Vatican. But most of that material would have been destroyed by the priests, such as the codices of the Maya, right? That there are many thousands of Mayan documents, codices, were destroyed by the Catholic Church. So all of that knowledge was just lost in this effort to forcibly convert the population. The same can be said in Peru. Many artifacts were destroyed. If they were of gold and silver, they would have been melted down and melted into bars and then shipped off to Spain. There was something called the Royal Fifth. A fifth of all the treasure that was discovered by the conquistadors had to go to the crown. So that was always being shipped back across the ocean. The Royal Fifth was constantly, there was a constant transit of gold and silver and other sort of precious metals and artifacts going over the ocean back to the King of Portugal or the King of Spain. So I think that if in the process of, let's say Peru, for example, the conquest of Peru, where the native populations are being incrementally conquered by the Spaniards, as they move through their sacred places, as they move through their temples, they're collecting artifacts. They're collecting knowledge. And that knowledge, and in some cases those artifacts, were probably related to the antediluvian world. And I would say, in some cases, definitely related to the antediluvian world, and specifically to giants.
The Nephilim, the mighty giants.
Alien cover-ups, UFOs, Nephilim conspiracies.
An ordinary Nephilim is one of the most dangerous beings in all of creation.
It's pure evil.
It's evil, sick, despicable.
In Peru, there are records, many records, that come out of the chronicles of the conquest of Peru. So in other words, from the very same documents that we derive the history of Peru. You know, Prescott wrote his famous the Conquest of Peru, which is a phenomenal tome. I mean, it's a wonderful read. He derived all of that historical information from the chronicles, which are today kept in the library, in Lima, but they've also been digitized, so you can search them, especially if you're a historian, you have access to that library. And I interfaced with a Peruvian historian. His last name was De la Vega, in Puno. I met with this, and he's a very well-known historian. He specializes in history of the Inca, in the Inca Empire. And I sat down with him, and I wanted to know if he had ever encountered any evidence of giants in Peru. And he said, well, I know that there's legends of giants in Peru, but I'm not aware of any historical evidence of giants in Peru. And so we met in a coffee shop, and I interviewed him in this coffee shop, and we went our separate ways after that. Well, the following morning, De La Vega shows up at my hotel. And he walks into the lobby, and he's got a big smile on his face, and he's holding he's holding a disc in his hand, a CD, and he hands it to me. And he said, yesterday after our discussion, you got me thinking about this, if there's any historical records of giants. So he said, I went into the digital files of the chronicles that we have access to as historians in Peru, and I did a search. I queried anything related to giants or unusual skeletons, unusual remains, skeletal remains that were discovered during the conquest. And he said, I could not believe how many instances I was able to find related to giants in the historical documentation. He said, here's some of them. He said, this is not even all of them. These are just the ones I was able to find last night. I highlighted them for you in these documents on the CD, the digital files. So I reviewed those files later on, and there were dozens from different chroniclers, from the 1500s to the 1600s, I think even up into the 1700s. Different historical accounts from the archives in Lima of the remains of giants being discovered in Peru. And they were not ambiguous. These are not instances in which the remains of giant sloths or dinosaurs can be confused with giants. So they're not ambiguous. We found a large, femur that we think belonged to an ancient race of giants. It's not that. It's not that at all. It's very specific accounts in which clearly the cadavers, the skeletal remains of gigantic humanoids were discovered. So I have no doubt that during the conquest and as a result of the conquest, the Church of Rome, the Vatican, has accrued not only artifacts related to the antediluvian world, but a lot of knowledge. And because of my experience in Sardinia, and because of some of the things that I was told in Sardinia, I believe that the Vatican is in possession of skeletal remains, in some cases mummified cadavers of giants. And when I say giants, I'm not talking 7 foot tall. I'm talking 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way up to 15 foot tall. I have no doubt, because the conquistadors were finding them in Peru, and in recent history, the residents of Sardinia were finding them all over Sardinia. I interviewed dozens of people in Sardinia who dug up the bones of giants. And we're talking about skeletal remains that were intact with clothing and jewelry, rings on the fingers, necklaces around the necks. And last I've checked, dinosaurs and giant sloths and mammoths didn't wear jewelry. They didn't wear bling. So in some cases, I was told that there were particular priests who were directing the villagers in Sardinia to bring them any remains that they had of giants. And in some of those cases, the remains were burned. In other cases, they were sequestered away. To where? Who knows? While I was in Sardinia, I interviewed 2 individuals, and both of these individuals were hired to excavate in an official capacity in this particular site that had to do with Nuragic ruins. And the Nuragic culture is a very ancient, mysterious culture that once existed in Sardinia. I think it was a Bronze Age culture. And very mysterious culture, very interesting. But what's even more interesting is that where were they excavating? Of course, beneath a church, or on the premises of the Catholic Church. There was a small cathedral there called the Cathedral of Anastasia in the province of Sadara. And you can go there to this day, and I was in the church of Anastasia, and you can see where the excavations took place on the grounds of the church and beneath the church. And this demonstrates the sort of archaeological treasure, the knowledge that the Catholic Church, just because they occupied these sites, were able to secretly accrue over the centuries. In this case, both of these gentlemen were involved in the excavation and retrieval of not only the bones of giants, but entire skeletons and cadavers of giants, some of which were very well preserved. And these bodies were 8, 9, 10 foot tall. Both of these guys, at different periods of time, they excavated numerous cadavers at the same site. And when they would find these body parts or entire skeletal remains of giants or cadavers of giants, the procedure was everything that they found, everything that they were excavating, because they weren't there looking for the bodies of giants. At least that they weren't told that. They were told to excavate the site, to excavate the artifacts. And it wasn't just these two individuals. There was a group of people, and they were working in shifts. And the protocol was any artifacts or skeletal remains that were excavated from the site were to be placed inside of the church. So they're excavating the Nuragic ruins on the grounds of the cathedral and then taking all of the artifacts and placing them in the church. Now, this excavation was being overseen, in part at least, by the University of Cagliari, or a university in Cagliari. And Cagliari is the capital city in Sardinia. Sardinia, of course, is a province of Italy. And I believe there was some oversight also from the Catholic Church. I mean, it was their property. So there's going to be oversight from the Catholic Church. So it must have been some sort of a collaboration between the university at Cagliari and the Catholic Church. Again, this being property of the Catholic Church. So all of these artifacts are going into the church. In fact, there were so many artifacts being excavated, including the bodies and bones of giants. And then after all of these artifacts would be placed into the church during the day, during the excavation, overnight, both of these guys told me this, overnight somebody would come and take them all away. So these guys would return to the excavation site in the morning to the Church of Anastasia, open the doors, and it's empty. Everything was secreted away at nighttime, all of it. They were collecting so many artifacts that they were running out of space in the church. And one of these individuals I interviewed, he decided to go talk to the guy that was in charge of the excavation or overseeing it. And he sat down in his office and he said, we need a bigger space. Is there somewhere else that we can put these artifacts and these humanoid remains that we're finding? Is there somewhere else? I mean, is there another warehouse where we just have too much stuff and we're having to pile stuff up in there and we don't want to ruin the artifacts? And this individual looked at him and he leaned over to him and he said, "Mind your effing business."
How rude!
He said, "This is none of your business. Mind your effing business and go back to work." So he didn't say effing, obviously. He said the F word in Italian. And so this conveyed to the guy who was interviewing that they didn't want them to interfere at all. Just do your job. And they were told, by the way, not to talk about the artifacts that they were excavating. So it was sort of a hostile environment. He told me, this particular individual, again, there were two guys. He told me that one time he was excavating at Anastasia and he uncovered a huge skull and the vertebrae was still attached. So the backbone, the vertebrae was still attached. He said it was so large, his wife was excavating at the site with him on this particular day, that it took him and his wife together to carry it. And he said he was holding the skull like this, right? So it's not like this, it's holding the skull like this. And his wife is walking behind him holding the vertebrae. And they carried the skull and the vertebrae into the Church of Anastasia and laid it on the table. Of course, the next morning, gone. Then he said they were excavating a chamber in a nuragi, which is those stone towers at the same site, at Anastasia. And the tower was sealed from the outside, and they had to break into it. And when they broke into the tower, and this kind of contradicts what I was saying earlier, by the way, that the towers weren't necessarily built for giants. They break into the tower, and he said that they discovered that there was a very well-preserved, gigantic person, dead, deceased, sitting at a table. And he must have been 9 feet tall, he told me, sitting at a table, and the table was very large, and all of the utensils on the table were overly large. So the cup was really large, the plate was really big, overly big, right? Unusually large. And he said that the oysters that he was eating were still preserved on the dish. Like you could still see the oysters and the shells, and so that room had like been hermetically sealed, and it was preserved. And he said this was like a cadaver. It wasn't like a skeleton. It was like a person who had been deceased for a long time, but preserved like in a coffin. Again, because it must have been buried rapidly, right, and sealed this person in there and killed them, probably suffocated them. And he said it was like 9 or 10 foot tall. He estimated the size, and a bunch of guys carefully removed this gigantic person, deceased, and laid him in the church. And one time, he communicated, one of these individuals, I can't remember which one, communicated to one of the professors who would come and sometimes oversee the excavation from the University of Cagliari. And they told the professor, we're finding some bodies here, and sometimes they're too large to put in the church, right? There's not enough room. There's no table large enough to lay them out on. What do we do with these large bodies? And it was always communicated, we're talking 8, 9, 10 foot tall. That's the size range, 8, 9, 10. And the professor told him, lay the bodies out in the yard at the side of the church. Lay them out, and we'll come and deal with them. So he said, I remember we laid out 3 bodies in a row, and the next day they were gone. So, I mean, these are the experience of the people in Sardinia. This isn't them accounting some secondhand thing. This is their firsthand experience. And these guys would describe, both of them, the rings that they would find were like that big for fingers, right? Everything was giant-sized. And I was able to interview dozens of people in Sardinia, most of them elderly people, who remembered personally having dug up the bones of giants. And in some cases, they were 12 feet long. And it was known. It was known in Sardinia at the time. We're talking about 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe going back to the 40s. And during that time, Sardinia has always been a very rural, rugged land. And it took a long time to modernize. So it was one of the last places in Italy to get modernized. In other words, the plumbing and the electrical and all of that, the building of roads, it took longer than in other places in Europe and Italy. And when they finally got around to modernizing Sardinia, they're building roads and digging trenches and digging for foundations of buildings, they were finding a lot of artifacts related to giants. Bones and hands, for example. When I say artifacts, I'm talking about like a hand of a giant sitting there with a ring on it. And this was so common that the people understood that if they were plowing in their fields or digging foundations for their houses or exploring around the Nuragic towers, that they might find the bones of giants. And if they did, there was a very strong possibility they would find jewelry on the hands or around the necks. And so they're always looking out for this, because obviously this is treasure. They would be able to sell these things. And they would often find them. In one case, I interviewed a man who was, I think he was 101 years old. But I interviewed him, and he was a very jovial fellow and very sharp for being, I think he was 101 years old. I think he was 101. Might have been 100, but I think he was 101 years old. He died not that long after the interview. Very, very sharp, though, for a guy 100 plus years old. And he told me the most extraordinary story. He told me that when he was a young man, he needed money, and so he went and hired himself out to a guy from the village that had a vineyard. And he and a bunch of other guys were out there working in the vineyard, and they were tilling the ground in the vineyard. And as they were tilling the ground, and this was a vineyard that was going to be newly planted, right? So the person in the village had acquired this property, and he was going to till the earth to plant a vineyard. And as these guys, the workforce is out there, including this individual I interviewed, as they're out there tilling the earth, they were starting to uncover bones. And this, by the way, was in the vicinity of a Nuragic, of one of these megalithic towers. So the Nuragic's here, and the vineyard's next to the Nuragic, and there's a dozen guys or so out there tilling the ground in preparation for the plantation of the grapes, and they're starting to dig up the bones of giants. And they're all sort of, they're surprised. And they excavate the bodies. They don't pull them out yet. They just dig them out. And they realize that they had a bunch of bodies of giants, 9 foot long, 9 foot long. And the bodies were all arranged in a crisscross pattern like this. And I think they determined it was north-south. I can't recall. It was either east-west or north-south. But they were all in a crisscross position, all aligned. And there were multiple bodies that were positioned like this. These are the skeletal remains, the cadavers of giants, right? And the owner of the vineyard said, "Stop. This is a problem. I'm going to get in trouble. We have to be careful." And he notified the authorities so that because it's bodies, right? You have to call the coroner. So he notifies the authorities and he tells them that they're unusually large bodies, right? That they're discovering in his vineyard, and they don't touch them. He doesn't want to get in trouble. I mean, this is like a crime scene or something, right? And what happens is he tells his workers, "Hey, I've just been informed the authorities are coming and they want everyone to vacate the field. Nobody is allowed to be around here. You guys have to leave. You have to go." So they had to cut their workday short. And this old fellow that I was interviewing, telling me this story, he said, "Well, I really needed the money. And I couldn't afford to just work a half day. I needed to work a full day. So I decided I'm just going to stick around and keep working so that I can go collect a full day's wage at the end of the day." He decided to disregard what the owner of the vineyard, his employer, had said. So he's there working, because he wants to collect his paycheck at the end of the day for a full day's work. And he said suddenly a bunch of vans pulled up. And I think he said something like 3 vans, like big vans or buses or something, pull up, and all these people get out. And he didn't know where they were from, but they looked very official. And he hid himself because they came into the field and they were measuring the bodies, they were taking pictures of the bodies, and then they were carefully stowing them away into the vehicles. And they were going into the tower. He watched as they went into the Nuragic tower, and they were inspecting the tower. And he said they removed a part of the tower, and they found a tunnel, and they sealed it up. And he watched all of this operation take place. And then he watched them load up the bodies, and then they left. And he had witnessed the entire thing. And this guy's 100 years old. He has no reason to lie to me about this. He's 100 years old. And he had other experiences besides that, but those were some of the most remarkable ones. He was digging one time. This will connect to what we were talking about earlier. One time he was digging, and again, 100 years old, he's a young man, so this is sometime in the early 20th century. He was digging for the foundation of a house, just as a laborer, right? And he and some guys are digging with shovels, and they hit something hard, and they realized it was this large, I think it was a stone coffin, and it had a stone lid on it. And they uncovered it, and they pushed the lid off, the lid of the coffin, and he said there was an enormous body inside, and it was draped in black cloth. So it had been wearing some sort of a black robe or dress, and you could still, the cloth was deteriorated, but it was still there. And the body was, it looked like if you were to open a casket, but it was ancient, and he said it was enormous. It was a gigantic body. And he said inside the coffin, and this was very interesting, he said inside of the coffin, there were coins, Roman coins. And the coins had the inscription and the likeness of Antonius Pius, the Roman emperor. And so you have a body of a giant and coins that date that body to the time of the Roman emperor Antonius Pius. And Antonius Pius was emperor in Rome in the mid-2nd century. So you have coins that date this gigantic body. He didn't tell me how large the body was, but he said it was enormous. But the really interesting part is that he told the local priest about the body. And he told the priest, who was, for whatever reason, was in charge of this construction. Maybe it was, maybe they were digging out, building foundations or digging out for foundations of a church or something. I don't recall the details, but the priest told him to break the bodies up and throw them into the foundation. He said, break up those bones and throw them into the foundation. And then he had him give him all of the Roman coins. So break the bodies up, get rid of the bones of this giant person, and give me the coins. That's pretty much how. And he was laughing about it when he told me. So that was very interesting. I heard dozens of stories like this, dozens of stories where people are plowing in their fields and they're uncovering skulls that are this big in Sardinia in the 20th century. And I'm fortunate that I was able to talk to a lot of these elderly people who are surely deceased today, like that gentleman who's 100 years old, but others who were in their 80s, some in their 90s. And it was common knowledge. And if you talk to the younger people, they would say, oh yeah, my grandparents used to tell me that they would find bodies of hands of giants, gigantic fingers with rings on them, or that they knew that those things were being found in Sardinia. Not only do you have the Nuragic towers, megalithic towers in Sardinia, you also have what are called to this day the tombs of the giants. And the tombs of the giants in Sardinia are megalithic tombs. And they're shaped, I did a film on all this, by the way, when I was working with Steve Quayle at Gen 6 Productions. We produced a film where we feature all these testimonies that I'm telling you. And the film is called Holocaust of Giants, and you can probably still find it somewhere. But at the time, when I was investigating these tombs, I thought that they were shaped in the form of a bull's head. And this is what I say in the film. They're shaped in the form of a bull's head. And indeed, they look like a bull's head. So if you can imagine like a sort of an oval shape followed by like curved horns, right? So it's a shape that sort of looks like a bull's head. But it occurred to me later that they're not shaped like a bull's head. They're shaped like a womb. They're shaped like a womb. And specifically, they're shaped like a uterus with the fallopian tubes. So you can imagine both, like a bull's head, but I think more accurately, a uterus. And why were these tombs shaped like a uterus? Well, the answer is because they were used specifically for a particular rite of passage by the Nuragic people. And the rite of passage is referred to today as the rite of incubation. The rite of incubation. And so you can imagine why they would shape the tomb like a uterus, because there were young people incubating. In other words, it was like a birth was going to happen. It was a rite of passage, like a rebirth, like a new birth. And the purpose of the ritual was that these young people would go into the tomb, because in these tombs, there's a few different kinds of tombs in Sardinia, but what they all have in common is a gallery. They have this internal gallery, and then they have like imagine the shape of the uterus, which looks like the bull's head with the fallopian tubes coming out, and then the gallery is inside of this megalithic tomb. And there's a little doorway. Sometimes there's like a stele, like a large stone with a little doorway cut into it. It's almost like a little doggy door, right? And then sometimes there's a trilithon door. It's actually megalithic stones. And it's a trilithon door, but with a small doorway to where you have to stoop down to get into it. But the stele doorways, like the little doggy doors, are very small so that only very young people could get into them. Like we're talking, teens or preteens. Whatever the coming of age was to the Nuragic people, obviously these guys were pretty young. These boys were pretty young, probably in their early teens. And the rite of incubation involved either one or multiple of these young people crawling into the tomb through the opening. And these tombs, in my opinion, at least some of them were likely mounds. They were likely covered with earth. So it would have looked like a mound. And the young person would crawl into the tomb, and then the tomb would be sealed for a certain amount of time, and that young person would incubate in the tomb. Now, there's probably a couple things going on here. Probably there may be psychedelic substances involved in this. I don't know if that's the case or not. But what I do know is that they're not just in there incubating in a tomb to communicate with their ancestors. They incubate in the tomb to communicate specifically with the mighty ones who are buried beneath the tomb. They're there to communicate with the spirits of dead Nephilim, dead Rephaim, who are buried beneath the tombs, not in the tombs, beneath the tombs. And a lot of archaeologists today will scoff at the notion that the tombs of the giants were built for giants. Well, in one sense, they're correct. The tombs of the giants weren't built to house the bodies of the giants, although they are big enough to do so. I measured them myself. The giants were buried beneath the tombs so that the galleries were built on top, and the young people could go in and incubate with the spirit of the giant. These things were potentially factories for demon possession. I mean that's one way to look at it. You go into the tomb, you get possessed by a spirit of a Nephilim, the spirit of a dead giant, which are the possessing spirits according to the scriptures, and you come out demonized. Or it could be that you're just trying to communicate with your mighty ancestors, the giants, and somehow be imbued with their prowess, their power, their strength and capability in battle, and so forth. But very interesting. The tombs of the giants, megalithic tombs, were built for the rite of incubation, and they're shaped like uteruses. People don't realize that there were more megaliths in Sardinia than any other place in the world that we know of so far. There were over 30,000 megalithic Nuragic towers on the island. 30,000. And of course, the conventional explanation is that these towers served a defensive purpose. In other words, they were built like castles, but there's just way too many of them. 30,000 on one island. And I'm convinced that the towers and the tombs are related. In fact, you can usually find tombs of giants in the vicinity of towers. The towers and the tombs are related, and I think they're both related to communication with the giants, with the Rephaim, with the Nephilim that are buried in the soils of Sardinia. But also the towers clearly have an astronomical purpose. So there's something very interesting, an interesting relationship between the megalithic tombs and the megalithic towers. I believe that this ancient Nuragic culture was actually the root culture of the Canaanites and of the Canaanitish peoples that were inhabiting the Levant, the Promised Land, during the conquest by Joshua and the Hebrews. I think that this was a stronghold. Sardinia, the island of Sardinia, was a stronghold of the offspring of the Watchers, of the descendants of the Nephilim in the post-flood world, and that they had migrated to the Levant from Sardinia and probably migrated back to Sardinia after the conquest, or during the conquest, some of them at least, of Canaan. But it's clear that the Nuragic civilization, this ancient mysterious civilization, the roots of it are Canaanitish. There's a lot of similarities between the Nuragic culture, the ancient Nuragic culture, and the ancient Canaanites. And it's known that the Phoenicians also inhabited the island of Sardinia, and the Phoenicians were Canaanites. And so it's very possible that the island of Sardinia, that was the origin of the Phoenicians themselves. Because again, the Phoenicians were Canaanites. So it might have been the origin of the Canaanites who migrated to the shores of the Levant a long time ago, and then had established themselves before Joshua entered the Promised Land and drove most of them out. Not all of them, but most of them. The island of Sardinia is a part of Italy. It's located off of the western coast of Rome, and it's below Corsica. So you have mainland Italy here, and then you have Corsica, and then you have Sardinia. And Sardinia has been traditionally a very rugged and difficult place to keep under control. The Romans had a hard time. They used it, they mined Sardinia, but they were mostly occupying the coastal regions. The Sardinian people have always been very difficult to subdue. And I think, the heritage of the Sardinia people, we know today, many of the modern Sardinians are actually related to the Phoenicians. They have Phoenician genetic markers. That's why in Sardinia today, you'll find quite a lot of people with red hair. Red hair is one of the genetic traits of the Sardinians.